In 1848, two young Germans published a pamphlet of barely 23 pages. The opening line was, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." They were right about the specter. But they could not have imagined the form it would take. Karl Marx designed a theory. Lenin turned it into revolution. Stalin turned it into a state. And between the theory and the state, a gap opened that may be the most tragic in all of economic history. Today we are going to trace that gap. Without simplifying the theory. Without ignoring the reality. Because the distance between what communism promised and what it produced is, in itself, one of the most important lessons of 20th century economics. In the previous episode we saw that socialism is a broad family. The Social Democrats chose gradual reform. But another branch, the Marxist one, rejected compromise. For Marx, capitalism could not be reformed. It could only be replaced. This idea materialized in 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. From that moment on, communism stopped being a theory and became a real economic system, applied to hundreds of millions of people in dozens of countries. What happened deserves to be told with rigor. Without caricatures in either direction. To understand communism, you have to start with what Marx actually said. We already covered this in part 11, but it is worth summarizing the key points. Marx started from an observation. In capitalism, workers produce more value than they receive in wages. The difference, the surplus value, is kept by the capitalist. This is not an accident. It is the structure of the system. Capitalist profit, according to Marx, is unpaid labor. From that observation, Marx built a theory of history. Every economic system generates contradictions that destroy it from within. Feudalism generated a bourgeoisie that overthrew it. Capitalism generates a proletariat that will do the same. History advances through class conflict, and capitalism is just one more stage. The society that would come after capitalism would have two phases. First, socialism, workers would control the means of production and the state would redistribute according to labor contributed. Later, when abundance was sufficient and classes had disappeared, communism proper would arrive, a society without a state, without classes, without private property, where each person would receive according to their needs. It is important to understand that Marx imagined communism as a society of radical freedom. No state to oppress. No exploitation. No alienation. Every person free to develop their potential. It was a profoundly humanist vision, paradoxical as that may seem in light of what came afterward. Marx expected the revolution to happen in the most industrialized countries, England, Germany, France. Countries where capitalism was mature and the proletariat was large. It happened in Russia. An agrarian, semi-feudal country with a tiny industrial proletariat. Lenin adapted the theory to Russian reality. Where Marx spoke of revolution as the inevitable result of capitalism's contradictions, Lenin introduced the Vanguard Party, a revolutionary elite that would accelerate the process and direct the transition. In October of 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. What followed was a devastating civil war. And the first economic decision was radical: war communism. Total nationalization. Grain confiscation from peasants. Abolition of money. Centralized distribution of resources. The results were catastrophic. Widespread famine. Production in freefall. In 1921, Lenin reversed course with the new economic policy, which reintroduced market elements. It was an implicit admission that an economy without markets did not work even in the short term. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin consolidated power and abandoned the compromises. In 1928 he launched the first five-year plan. The logic was simple and brutal: transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian country into an industrial power in the shortest possible time. The production results were impressive in raw terms. Industrial output increased 50% during the first five-year plan. The USSR went from producing a fraction of global industry to becoming the second industrial power on the planet in barely 2 decades. But the human cost was devastating. The forced collectivization of agriculture caused famines that killed millions of people, including the Holodomor in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. The gulags provided slave labor for the great projects. The purges eliminated any dissenting voice. The falsification of statistics became standard practice. And here a problem appeared that the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises had predicted in 1920, the economic calculation problem. Without market prices, central planners had no reliable way to know what to produce, how much to produce, or how to allocate resources efficiently. They could order a dam or a steel factory to be built. But they could not know whether the dam or factory was the best use of available resources. Soviet factories produced according to quotas set from above. If the quota was measured in tons, they produced few very heavy items. If the quota was measured in units, they produced many uselessly small items. The manipulation of figures and the inflation of results spread throughout the entire system. What the plan said and what was actually happening diverged more and more. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. He followed a path similar to the Soviet one: agrarian collectivization, forced industrialization, 5-year plans. But he added an even more intense ideological component. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, aimed to industrialize China in record time. Millions of peasants were mobilized to produce steel in improvised furnaces, abandoning the fields. The result was the worst famine in human history. Estimates vary, but historians speak of between 15 and 55 million deaths between 1959 and 1961. The Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976, added another layer of destruction. Universities closed. Intellectuals were sent to the countryside. Ideology was imposed over technical competence in every sphere. But the Chinese story has a second act. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping launched the reforms that would transform the country. Special economic zones. Opening to foreign investment. Private agricultural markets. Private ownership of businesses. Deng called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. His critics called it state capitalism. Whatever it was, it worked. China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the following decades. What China demonstrated is that pure central planning does not work, but also that markets can coexist with an authoritarian single-party state. A result that does not fit comfortably into any theory, neither Marxist nor liberal. Cuba offers another instructive case. After the revolution of 1959, Fidel Castro built a centrally planned system with Soviet support. The results were mixed and must be presented honestly. In education and healthcare, Cuba achieved notable results for a country at its income level. Near universal literacy. A healthcare system that produced doctors in quantities that astonished the world. Life expectancy comparable to much wealthier countries. But in economic terms, stagnation was chronic. Dependence on the Soviet Union was total. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Cuba entered a brutal economic crisis. In 2010, Fidel Castro himself acknowledged that the Cuban model, based on Soviet central planning, was no longer sustainable. Today Cuba is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, with high inflation, food shortages, and widespread poverty. The social achievements in education and healthcare are eroding as the economy deteriorates. The distance between the theory and practice of communism is measured in human lives. Tens of millions of people died in famines caused by forced collectivization. Millions more in political purges, labor camps, and repression. But it is also true that millions of people lived in communist systems that provided them with education, healthcare, and job security they would not have had in the available alternatives. An illiterate peasant in Tsarist Russia in 1910 had worse living conditions than a Soviet worker in 1960. That does not justify anything. But it does complicate the narrative. For the families who lived under these systems, the experience was contradictory. Basic material security but lack of freedom. Formal equality but privileges for the party elite. Universal education but a prohibition on thinking freely. The harshest lesson of 20th century communism is not that equality is bad. It is that concentrating all economic and political power in a single institution, the party state, tends to produce tyranny, regardless of the original intentions. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, Marx imagined communism as a society of radical freedom, without a state and without classes. It was a humanist vision. But he left unresolved how to get there without the power needed for the transition becoming permanent tyranny. Second, in practice, central planning proved incapable of allocating resources efficiently at scale. The economic calculation problem that Mises identified in 1920 was confirmed repeatedly. The USSR, China, and Cuba experienced the same patterns: initial achievements in industrialization or social services, followed by chronic stagnation and systematic falsification of data. Third, the human cost of 20th century communist experiments was enormous. The famines, purges, and repression were not accidents. They were consequences of a system that concentrated all power in a party with no checks and balances. China abandoned central planning and adopted markets while maintaining political control. Cuba acknowledged the model's failure but found no viable alternative. Communism collapsed across most of the world. But pure capitalism also had serious problems: inequality, insecurity, recurring crises. Most democracies found a middle path. A system where capitalism continues to function but the state cushions its harshest effects. We call it the welfare state. And its story, next time.